Hello, my name is Johnny Gardner, and thanks for joining us for episode 8 of the Cedar60 Podcast. This week's episode is an interview with Dr. Glen Duerr, Associate Professor of International Relations at Cedarville University. Building on a diverse career in political science, Dr. Duerr has recently published Patriotism and the Cross, which is a deep dive into the complex relationship between patriotism and faith in Jesus Christ, and is available for purchase now on Amazon. Dr. Duerr also serves as Policy Fellow for the Wallace Institute for Arctic Security and currently serves as a City Council member in Beaver Creek, Ohio. And now, here is Benjamin May's interview with Dr. Glen Duerr on the current state of Chinese politics, the Chinese Church, and the American Christian's role in these issues.
Hello and welcome to Cedar60. My name is Benjamin Mays. Today we have the honor of having Dr. Glen Duerr joining us. Dr. Duerr, thank you for joining the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
So today we're going to be talking about a topic that has been in the news lately and has great importance in realms of global issues, politics, and that is the rise of China. I'm sure that a lot of people have been concerned lately as this issue has risen in the news in respect to politics. We have perhaps international espionage in the news with certain US senators, but there's more than that. There's this issue of economics and perhaps even military threat. So Dr. Duerr, many people in your field and even in the media and politics disagree on if China is as severe of a threat or if it is just economically a threat to the United States. But Dr. Duerr, how would you define the current relationship between the United States and China currently?
I guess to be pithy, frenemies. It's obviously a lot more complex than that, and there's a significant friendship, a massive amount of trade annually, now in excess of 750 billion. But at the same time, as you mentioned, there are challenges. China is now, I would argue, the only peer competitor of the United States in terms of economics and military and technological power, and even to some extent soft power. And so the relationship is complex because you have the United States, although messy, a robust constitutional republic with a democratic framework. And with China, it's an authoritarian Chinese Communist Party that really can be described in some areas as fully totalitarian, especially with the rise of closed caption television and the way that the Great Firewall of China is also operates in the web. And so when it comes to areas like the South China Sea, it's increasingly contested. China is also building its Belt and Road Initiative, kind of the old Silk Road back to Europe. But also has a major play in parts of East Africa, Latin America. And so in a way, if the enemy side is growing, then the world does become a point of contestation. But I don't want to go too far with that because simply, like I said, there's a lot of trade, great relationships between peoples, significant travel. So I think the frenemies label is useful.
So the United States and China are definitely very closely connected with, like you said, trade, economically, and even politically. But in the last 4 years under the Trump administration, that relationship has been strained. I think that would be fair to say. With the new incoming Biden administration in the next few days, how do you see this relationship with China playing out? Economically, we got numbers overnight that suggest that China's economy grew at 2.3%. With the pandemic taking place last year, many nations around the world, including the United States, slowed economically. So moving forward with the new administration, do you think trade is going to be an issue for the United States and China like it was under the Trump administration, or do you see that relationship getting better?
It's hard to tell because it depends if there's a flashpoint. Uh, Ultimately, I would imagine that a President Biden would be more dovish on China than Trump. Trump has certainly put China front and center, called them a currency manipulator, China flu, all kinds of different things. And to some extent, it's been useful because if China had risen as a peaceful and democratic country, I don't think too many people have been all that worried. So with the Obama, Bush, and Clinton administrations, they really assumed that with China's economic growth, it would lead ultimately to China democratizing, or at least opening up, improving human rights. And in the political science literature, it is shown this, that any country that grows significantly economically, that has an advanced middle class, that middle class pushes the government for greater rights, and eventually they democratize. And with China, it just hasn't happened that way. And I think a lot of people in the United States have woken up to the reality that China probably won't become a Jeffersonian democracy anytime soon. And as a result, I think the Biden administration is going to have to take a different tactic. And if China tries anything, especially in the South China Sea, or if there's some form of issue with a naval vessel, but even some form of conflict in the air, then it will have to take on a much tougher tone. And so I think in the short term, at least in 2021, we'll probably see a bit of a detente with China. But at the same time, Biden is already looking to 2024. And so one of the places that he's going to have to try and win again is the Midwest. And if a lot of the manufacturing sector remains in China, then that could be an impact in the Midwest if those jobs aren't replaced, or at least there's not a significant shift. And so it'll be interesting to see, especially 2021, 2022.
That's very true, and it could be almost a reversal back to 2016 again, with the economic opinions that Americans have towards China. As you just mentioned, a lot of Republicans have criticized Joe Biden for not being tough enough on China, like President Trump was. But at the same time, some Republicans and many Democrats have criticized President Trump for not being tough enough on China when it comes to the domestic issues, like the human rights abuses that have been clearly going on in China under the current president. And President Xi is definitely not going to be giving up power in China anytime soon. But when it comes to international relations, the role that domestic issues play matter, like religion, freedom, and persecution.
So these issues in the political science literature are known as intermestic issues, so international and domestic. And you're absolutely right, because they play a massive role. And usually the United States is very forthright about looking at human rights. What's happening to the Uyghurs in Western China, in Xinjiang province, could be a modern day Holocaust. And it's always dangerous to draw parallels or to talk about the Holocaust, because I don't want to water it down as to the brutality of what happened in the 1940s. But there really could be widespread and systematic extermination, a real genocide. And we have no idea as to the numbers or what it looks like. There are quote unquote re-education camps. Han Chinese have been moved into the area to water down any ethnic strongholds of the Uyghurs, waters down a lot of culture. And so I think a lot of Americans, but typically in the private realm, have raised this issue. And hopefully the Biden administration will do so as well. And if we look at the wider church, the Christian church in particular, One that was really doing quite well about 5 years ago. The numbers were really growing with the greater totalitarianism, as I've called it, under Xi Jinping. There are a lot of churches being brought down, just really reduced to rubble. A lot of pastors are facing greater persecution, and the underground church has gone even deeper underground. And so this is a really problematic time. And it looks like the Biden administration will raise some of these issues, but it's very delicate because China is very, very sensitive. And really, they haven't said an awful lot about the 2020 election. They didn't really even acknowledge the results until basically about 2 months after. And even then, it was a mid-level foreign affairs bureaucrat that kind of said, "Yeah, congratulations, Biden." But on the chaos at the Capitol, really the riots that we saw at the beginning of this month, the Chinese news has been very, very quick to try and draw parallels with Hong Kong, arguing that the United States has really been hypocritical. That we talk about Hong Kong as being pro-democracy, but what happened at the Capitol being thuggish and authoritarian. And I see that from our vantage point, absolutely. But the Chinese have basically said, well, you need to stop talking about Hong Kong in the United States because look, they're the same. They're not the same, but that's the parallel that they're trying to draw.
It definitely is, and it's maybe debatable whether or not it's a Cold War between the United States and China, but tensions are certainly very high. These things come down to really optics and who is winning the optics war with propaganda and things like that. You have the issue at the Capitol, which I believe was referred to by a Chinese youth group as that violence being a beautiful thing, and that the United States' democratic facade was simply false. This is a perhaps historic turning point on the world stage with the United States and China, perhaps a new Cold War beginning, or perhaps has been going on for the last 4 years and will continue. As Christians, we have, I think, an opportunity here. We have an opportunity to call out the Christian persecution in China, but the president of China has long-term goals for his nation. He wants to overtake the United States within the decade. Am I correct?
Absolutely. So there are a few things there. The beautiful thing quote is a shot at Nancy Pelosi. And so it's kind of interesting because when the Hong Kong protests were ongoing, from as her position as the Speaker of the House on the House floor, she called it a beautiful thing, and I would agree. I don't often agree with Nancy Pelosi, but I think she was spot on that, and would stand behind her fully. And so when the house was actually ransacked and the mob came through, that's when China tried to say, oh, it's a beautiful thing, trying to take a shot at her and the United States. And that's an unfair thing. But I also see because it pertains to the wider question, and you raised the issue of a second Cold War, and the term is useful because I think it does describe the period in which we're entering, or have entered, I would argue, since really 2018. We've entered a second Cold War, but it is worth quickly on a tangent saying that this would have different characteristics from the Cold War with the Soviet Union on two fronts. One is, again, the massive trade between the two countries. The US and the Soviet Union had very, very little. The US and China is the #1 trade relationship in the entire world, and even overtook our relationship with Canada in the last few years. The second characteristic is when the Cold War began, 1946, 1947, we didn't have a world order. It was being created. So the UN, what became the EU, NATO, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, everything that we have in place today was just being founded. So there was no world order, so to speak. It was just being created. And so the second Cold War is starting with an existing world order. And China plays by the rules, and they're trying to push at those rules and maybe alter them. And I think that's a part of this quote unquote Cold War that we're entering. But it is dangerous because you see the sheer size of both militaries. Xi Jinping has clear goals for his country, and it's going to be interesting to watch because here's a guy that this year will turn 69 years old. So he's not young, but could go for another decade and a half. I mean, that's certainly possible, but could also die today. So China will look different. It would be in real disarray if he were to die today. Heart attack, stroke, something of that nature, or even become incapacitated. So China will look different depending on what happens to Xi Jinping. If he dies today or is incapacitated today, China will have to shift, it will have to change. A new leader will bring something new. A younger leader might be more nationalistic, strangely enough. It might have less restraint than Xi Jinping. So that is also worrying if it were to occur. But it could also lead to some shifts. There could be a Gorbachev of China, for example. We don't know. But if Xi Jinping remains in power and has a vision for the next 15 years or so, which I think he does, of course, there's one thing to say a philosophical vision, there's another thing to say pragmatic politics. And the two don't always mesh. But I do envision China wanting a greater say over the South China Sea. I do think that China wants a specialized position on the world stage, which includes keeping its enemies down. Japan, India will not get seats on the UN Security Council. China will have an exclusive economic zone over the South China Sea, definitely, but pushing to the east with Japan, and then greater territorial rights. And it could also become belligerent militarily. That is a possibility. Most of the world is ignoring what's happening with India right now, but there was a major skirmish in the summer of 2020 over the line of actual control between China and India. The two are again confronting each other at a very a point with significant altitude, and that's a dangerous one. And China really could push the envelope militarily in some ways, and so that is something really to watch, because if that begins to happen more, we're already seeing it with Russia and Turkey. And I would argue it's a fraying of the existing world order, which, if everyone starts doing it, what stops dictators around the world doing? Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela, pushing into Guyana, as one example. We could see this in a range of different areas, and the world would become much less safe. It would become much more violent than it is today.
It certainly would. And I worry often that perhaps the United States isn't doing enough to combat China because China is becoming so persistent and so powerful. Around the world, their influence is growing in South America and Africa, in the Middle East. You mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative. There's so much we could talk about with the rising of China. I want to ask, because I've wondered for a while now, you have the collapse of the Soviet Union and ultimately the fall of at least communism there, but you can't as easily defeat an idea or a ideology like communism is. So why has the United States not been able to upend communism in China? Why is that? Why is it working in China? Why is that so prevalent in their system of government?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I like to teach the 20th century as a war between four ideas. And World War One ended one of them, monarchism. So yes, we have monarchies today, but they're either in very small countries or like the United Kingdom, fully constitutional, democratic, etc. So monarchism exists, but it has no real power. It ended with World War One. With World War II, fascism. And even though, like you said, ideas can come back, they can look different. There are some, quasi-fascist regimes today. Fascism effectively ended with World War II. And likewise, I would argue that communism ended with the end of the Cold War, with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. And yet, China on paper is one of 5 communist regimes in the world. It has continued. And so the reason for that, arguably, is that it's not fully communist. It is, to some degree, it is a communist party, but it's socialism or communism with Chinese characteristics. And frankly, the Chinese economy has become much more of a state-led capitalism that looks like Japan and South Korea, except that it's authoritarian. Both of the others transition to democracy. And arguably Russia uses a similar thing. And even in the United Kingdom and some other European countries, the government is putting in place state-led infrastructure to compete, especially with China of tomorrow. That is, of course, anathema in the United States, but it is a challenge because effectively what happens is the government pours in a lot of money or gives very favorable loans to certain industries. Think the high-tech sector, think engineering, think the military, for example. And it's worked very well in the United States, but the Chinese model is gaining traction in certain parts of the world, as you mentioned a few of them. But what it does is it allows monies to move into that sector. That sector then creates a product that will rival some of the best around the world. And then they can actually pump in additional money to sell it for a cheaper price. And so it is tough for capitalist economies and industries to compete because all of a sudden there's a massive subsidy coming from the Chinese Communist Party, which can drive out of business some of these companies. And if that happens, then the only one left standing is the Chinese-owned industry, which is a problem because then they raise prices back to what they were, and there's no competition left. And so it is a real puzzle for Western policymakers because, if you're like me, you love the free market, you love how capitalism works, but if it fails here, and the only option left in key sectors is a Chinese-owned company, that's a problem. That's a problem with Huawei, with ZTE, and it's why it's caused so many headlines around the world and especially in the West.
You have to wonder with China being so ambitious economically, then will the United States continue to be number one economically in the near future? And I know we mentioned briefly, if we could, we have the Belt and Road Initiative, which I find fascinating with what China's doing with that across the Middle East, all the way into Europe with their really changing how transportation and trade works from a logistics standpoint. Is the United States doing anything similar as far as maybe a new 21st century approach to expanding their trade routes around the world to combat or to at least catch up to what China's doing?
On the one hand, the U.S. is a little flat-footed because typically what we do alongside the IMF and the World Bank is provide loans, and we attach human rights issues to it. And I think that's very good. But China gives loans without any strings attached, and it's gained real traction with dictators, as you can imagine. Building big mosques, soccer stadiums, things of that nature. But it's clear that China has an infrastructure plan. Their high-speed rail network is really very impressive. The way that their goods are moved around the world is likewise impressive. The mega cargo ships have really become quite amazing. They still have some catching up to do with the United States because our goods still have a much greater cachet. If you just think of Coca-Cola, for example, or jeans, things of that, those types of industries, China has no equivalent. NBA basketball, but also our softer power measures, democracy, freedom of speech, human rights, those are very, very attractive to wide segments of the world, but we don't have this kind of infrastructure plan in place to connect, say, the United States with Chile and Argentina, which, we've kind of said, okay, it's in our backyard, as long as you're not causing too many problems, we're fine with you. And maybe that's been the wrong tactic. It worked during the Cold War of, hey, we need to defeat the Soviet Union, but maybe there's a lack of ambition trying to connect these areas. And China is really trying to be able to move goods and people really from the United Kingdom all the way through China. A lot of governments have rebuffed them, but as you mentioned at the beginning of the question, as China becomes the world's greatest economic power in terms of overall GDP and not just purchasing power parity, that really could happen at some point in this decade, that becomes a danger. At some point, the United States has less money to put in and compete in terms of the military, in terms of trade, and so if China's playing the long game, by 2030, by 2040, it could, if it's patient, start really working on some democratic regimes. Italy is one, for example, but even into the Balkans in Southeastern Europe, it's kind of lower hanging fruit because there's a big investment coming. And it's harder to get in the EU and things of this nature. So it does have to be watched, and maybe even a greater plan has to be put in place to counteract it. We've been very good with some of our major allies in Western Europe. They see the dangers in it too, but there's something attractive to the high-speed rail of moving people, of gaining with the rise of the Chinese economy, and there are challenges afoot. That it is unfortunately a shortcoming of democracy because all the planning is short term. How do I win office again? And so it requires, I think, people in the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense type positions being very wary of this, and maybe even trying to draw up a longer term plan that would encompass and would push back. But that's hard to do in a democratic system where the time, the windows of time are much more reduced, 2 years, 4 years, etc.
Yes, it really is, I think, the long term that our nation should be focused on. Meanwhile, the United States' infrastructure here at home could use some help itself. I want to go ahead and turn. Yeah. Yes, it really is. So here at Cedar60, we like to show how our faith as Christians intersects all areas of life, including politics, global issues, even things like the rise of China. And as we just mentioned, there is a huge population of Christians in China, and we have a regime in China that has recently become more restrictive for Christianity in China against religious freedom. While China claims openly to have freedom of religion, we know differently. How can Christians here in the United States work to promote religious freedom like we have here in the United States, around the world, and in places like China? What can we do right now to help?
Yeah, it's a great question and a tricky one because there are several moving pieces here. So in the United States, strong Christian presence, long been part of the democratic process. My pastor this Sunday talked about, we're not necessarily in a post-Christian moment in the United States. Maybe we're even in an anti-Christian moment. And so that's going to make it a little more difficult at the governmental level to do anything, but it doesn't stop the private sector. There are many private charities and groups that raise awareness. But it could also be an interesting point of intersection, because it could actually be Christians that draw the bridge between China and the United States. And what I mean by that is, we don't know the exact numbers, but somewhere between 50 million and 100 million Christians live in China. And some scholars argue that that could actually grow to 250 million in the next decade or two. That was before the big Xi Jinping clampdown, so it's going to be hard to know. But even though that's a fraction of the population, there could become a point for a Constantine moment where true Christianity, or biblical Christianity, is allowed or at least tolerated in China. And the other question that arises is, at what point does a Chinese Christian rise to the Politburo Standing Committee? At what point does a Chinese Christian actually sit in some of the top rooms? At what point is the Foreign Affairs Minister of China and the Secretary of State of the United States, at what point are they both believers in Christ? And if that happens, that could actually be a way where the world is at least somewhat shared, or there's a good pathway and peaceful pathway forward. There's part of me that kind of reviles that sentiment, because China's still deeply authoritarian and heavily communistic. But at the same time, if there's a peaceful outcome, that could also be a lot better than the alternative. So my generation of Christians, your generation of Christians, will really have to wrestle with this as we start gaining power. And that's going to happen over the next decade or so. The baby boomers remain very powerful. If you think of the outgoing president, the incoming president, the vice president, the Speaker of the House, pro tempore of the Senate, they're all 74 plus years old. And in the not too distant future, there's going to be a real generational change. And it's going to have a different look on things. And so with Christians in particular, it's still promoting freedom of religion. A lot of governments around the world try to do that. I think the United Nations has had some shortcomings there. It's a difficult one. I see what they're trying to balance, but it's really been a shortcoming. And so for Christians, it's to continue speaking out, to keep putting it on the agenda, keep making it an issue, and linking arms transnationally with other Christians around the world. It then gets into things like immigration and refugee and asylum status, which is very complicated and controversial, but it would also allow Christians to continue sharing the gospel and making disciples, and that is ultimately what we're called to do in Scripture.
I have to stop and just reflect how blessed we are in the United States, how blessed we have been to worship freely without giving it a second thought, while there are billions of Christians who cannot say the same. Perhaps Christianity is the key. Our faith could be the key to achieving peace with China and with perhaps the rest of the world. I believe that's what Scripture calls for us to do, the Great Commission. Really, really quickly, Dr. Duerr, are there any organizations that you know of in China that we could today support, pray for?
Yeah, I hesitate to use any by name, because often when they're published, there's a backlash. But what I'll say is that there are many U.S.-based organizations as well. Open Doors USA would be a big one in terms of pushing for religious freedom and really trying to disseminate Bibles within China. And there are a range of different organizations that have done this. sometimes it's pretty easy to just $20, $30 will allow you to buy 5 Bibles and then have them sent over. And I remember doing this about 15 years ago, and I actually got a name of 5 Chinese people that received the Bible. That's a dangerous one too, because now there's a linkage, and I think Christian organizations have limited that. But really, I think the other one is to pray for Chinese pastors that have really tried to stand up and make statements about, even though the government is now changing, here's what we believe and here's where we stand. And so I think to pray for those that are persecuted to be able to stand firm in the gospel is I think really the big one. And to look at organizations that can I think support the domestic church in China, the underground church in particular. And so, Google is a great way of doing that as well.
Oh, that's really good. Thank you. Dr. Duerr, we like to give our guests here at the podcast 60 seconds for any last final thoughts on the topic that we have been discussing today. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. 2 things. One is I'd continue to encourage a younger generation to look at the international sphere. I know we can get so caught up in domestic issues, but there's so much that happens intermestically that's linked. And so I'd encourage travel, I'd encourage study and focus on the things that happen globally. That I think is going to be a major key. And the second is that I'm always optimistic about our younger generation that's politically active, that's interested, that can look at issues with a new spin. Sometimes older generations get caught up in, well, this is the way it's always been. It's kind of stuck. And so especially a younger generation of Christ followers, be creative. Go through scripture. What are some ways that the world can be recast, re-envisioned? Try to look at things without boundaries. Don't get caught up in terms of people telling you can do this, but you can't do that. Because I think that is going to be a way forward. And bear in mind too that there are unexpected outcomes of every change, of every policy. To try and think through those, because it can be utopian to go, okay, this is what changes and it's going to lead to this. There will be other issues. Sorry, I don't think that was under 60 seconds, but
that's okay. Dr. Duerr, thank you so much for joining us today on Cedar60. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Hi there, YouTube. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Cedar60. If you enjoy exploring politics from a distinctly Christian perspective, please like this video, comment below about what you've learned, and share it with a friend. If you'd like to be notified about future episodes, subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow Cedar60 on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook, or look for our episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks so much.